Okay, we finally got live. Stefan, glad you're here. Don't know if anybody else is going to be here, but because this was a spur of the moment thing, but this is my first time to do a live presentation. And the reason why I'm doing it now is because Mike Colburn came on my channel and he advertised a presentation that he's doing right now. So we're going to have competing presentations, and I hope you don't mind that. What I want to talk with you about is a paper that I have done and that I have updated it recently. And so I'm going to read a little bit from that for you. And I'd like to share my screen with you if I can, so that I can talk about what's in my paper. Okay, here we go. This is a paper entitled Sabbatismus in Hebrews. And I would say that the key ideas that you're going to find in this presentation are, first of all, that we have overlooked the specific meaning of Sabbatismus in Greek, and we're going to look at the evidence for that. Second is to ask the question, is there evidence that early Jewish believers, the Hebrews, actually gave up the Sabbath, and that Hebrews 4 would be encouraging them to do that? All right. So that's what we want to think about as we look at this. Sabbatismus in Hebrews. We'll read from Lamsa's translation because it is a literal translation of the Aramaic or Syriac. For he said concerning the Sabbath, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. It is therefore the duty of the people of God to keep the Sabbath. For he who has entered into his rest also has ceased from his own works as God did from his. Now that's the specific mention of Sabbath in Hebrews 4. But in order to understand it, we're going to have to dig back a little bit into the chapter just before that, and we'll look at some specifics there. But let's ask this question. The Epistle to the Hebrews provides an indication of the continuing value that first century Nazarene believers saw in the Sabbath under the new covenant of grace. That is the covenant under which believers are forgiven their sins and God's laws are written in their heart. Okay. Now, somebody would like to make this a different set of laws, but the indication in Jeremiah is that it's the same laws that they didn't allow God to write in their heart that God does write in their heart. In 2 Corinthians talks about that. A living epistles written in the tables of the flesh. So what God wants to do is to write his law on our hearts. And it's been asked, why would you want to keep the Sabbath? Well, let's look at Hebrews, and we'll narrow our focus for that right now. The author of Hebrews refers to God's seventh day rest in verse 4 and the Sabbatismus rest that remains for the people of God in verse 9 as an illustration of a different kind of rest, a catapausis rest, which we find in Hebrews chapter 3 and also in chapter 4. So only one time is there a different kind of rest that's mentioned. Now, the question that I would like to ask is then, would a Nazarene believer have seen Hebrews 4 as dismissing the day of worship that they had always worshiped on? I don't think that would make sense. Without being told when to assemble for exhortation, they already knew. In fact, if we go to the Gospel of Luke, and Luke is probably a convert to Judaism, and he continues to use Jewish language, not just in the Gospel, but also in the book of Acts. He measures distance as a Sabbath day's journey. So he's not writing as a Gentile, he's writing as a believer and who understands the Sabbath and understands the festivals and a number of other things. So he puts it in a point of view, a different point of view. Okay, so then he uses in chapter 23 of Luke, which was written 30 years after the crucifixion, that the women went and rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Now, if they were resting according to some other commandment, he doesn't explain. They understand what day it is. They understand the basis for it, that there's a commandment. And therefore, he repeats that as something that they continue to do. And throughout the book of Acts, we see that they continue to keep the Sabbath. So there's no interruption in the story for Luke in either his gospel or in Acts of the Apostles. Now let's take a look at the alternate view. The alternate view is that they quit keeping the Sabbath. Now, I want you to notice a quotation just here for a second. Willie Rohrdorf in the Encyclopedia of the Early Church, and he is not a champion of the Sabbath. He's a first-day observing Christian. But he says, very frankly, that sources all agree that the Hebrews, to which this epistle was written, observed the Sabbath. That's to be taken as a given. All right, now let's take a look here. Okay, hey MJ, good to see you. Take a look here at the eighth day. Is there support for the Gnostic eighth day? Now, you may wonder what this is all about. What is the eighth day? If you want to look at the reasons for keeping Sunday, you have to go back to the earliest accounts, and we're going to look at those three. And in those accounts, they refer to the eighth day. It's often claimed that early Christians abandoned the seventh day and they observed the first day of the week. And the earliest apologists for that are Pseudo-Barnabas and Justin Martyr, and also a mention in Clement of Alexandria. So as we follow the allegorical exposition of Pseudo-Barnabas, he talks about in 6,000 years, all things will be finished. And he uses the phrase, and he rested on the seventh day, and interprets that as, then shall he truly rest on the seventh day. So it's using it in an allegorical way to talk about something not literal, not the literal days of creation, but something else. And then he goes on. Excuse me. Okay, you guys got to be quiet. The dogs they're going to keep bugging me until I let them in. All right, so let's pick up again where we are here. In Hebrews chapter 4, we find in stark contrast to, well, it jumped here on me when I wasn't looking. That's not what I want. All right, this is what we want right here. Further, he says, your new moons and your Sabbaths I cannot endure. He takes that from Isaiah chapter 1. You perceive how he speaks. Your present Sabbaths are not acceptable to me, but that which I have made, namely, that is giving. I'm not able to see it very well here. Sorry. Benji, you got to be quiet, sweetie. We're on camera right now. Okay. All right. So he says that the eighth day supersedes the seventh day and therefore is superior. That's the idea of the Gnostic eighth day. And then we go to okay. You got to be quiet, sweetie. I'm sorry. Okay. So that's the comparison with the eighth day. It's a Gnostic concept because in Gnosticism, they looked at the world as being in sevens and the 7 days representing this world. And in Gnostic thinking, the world is faulty. It's not very good, as the book of Genesis says, and as God declares, it's faulty. And so everything connected with it, including the seventh day, is faulty. And so you've got to supersede the seven and go to the eighth realm in Gnosticism in order to get out of the faultiness of this world. It's a very different way of thinking about the creation. Gnosticism takes the simple and straightforward teachings of the Old Testament and then gives it some kind of a mystical interpretation that goes beyond that. If we go to Clement of Alexandria, and we're going to look here at his statement, the Lord's Day, Plato prophetically speaks of in the 10th book of the Republic in these words: "And when the 7 days have passed to each of them in the meadow, on the 8th day, they're to set out and arrive in 4 days." Now, this is supposed to be a mention of the 8th day, and it's somewhat metaphorical. Did Clement actually mean the Lord's Day in the sense of the first day of the week and observing it as a day of worship? It's kind of questioning there, because he also says the one that keeps the Lord's Day abandons an evil disposition. So even that sounds like he's being metaphorical. So it may not be coincidence that Plato's Republic that he's quoting from turned up in the Gnostic texts at Nag Hammadi. All right, so let's take a look at Hebrews 4. In stark contrast to Pseudo, Barnabas, and Justin, and Clement of Alexandria, who adopt this 8th day terminology and allegory and promote a rest day that was supposedly superior to the Sabbath, first century believers saw the continuance of the 7th-day Sabbath under the new covenant. As we read in Lamps's version, it is therefore the duty of the people of God to keep the Sabbath. Now, one may wonder how it was that it was a duty. It was expected. It was to continue. Because where does the Sabbath come from? I'm going to try to take this out of this version so I can read it a little bit better. And then I won't be guessing at stuff like I've been doing here. All right. Let me make this a little bit better for me. And then I can just take care of it like this. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay. So we skipped over. That's what I couldn't see was here. Justin also refers to the 8th day, symbol of the 8th day, in his dialogue with Trypho. And he's using Gnostic numerology. All right. So let's now go here to the thinking in Hebrews, which is in stark contrast. It's therefore the duty of the people of God to keep the Sabbath. And a person may wonder, how is it a duty? Well, because of Genesis 2. Every time that God is talking about the Sabbath, it's harking back to the origin of the Sabbath. Genesis 2, he blesses the Sabbath and he sanctifies it because he rested on that day. In Exodus 20, when God gives the Sabbath, he declares it in chapter 20, and then he gives them the tablets after that. When he declares it, he says to remember the Sabbath, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. And so the Sabbath in Exodus 20 is also predicated upon Genesis 2. And then in Exodus chapter 31, he also talks about God rested and was refreshed. So again, it's pointing back to Genesis 2. If we go to Mark chapter 2 in the New Testament, Jesus talks about that the Sabbath was made for man, and man is a generic term. It's not just the Jews, it's for man. Just like in Mark, I guess it's chapter 10, he talks about that a man shall leave his father and mother and join to his wife. And it's not just talking about Jews. Marriage is for all human beings. So marriage and the Sabbath were given to man. It was made for man. Therefore, Mark 2 also points back to Genesis chapter 2. And now when we come here to chapter 4 of Hebrews, it begins the same way as we read up there. Let me go back to that again. For he said concerning the Sabbath, God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So in the Syriac, it points it out clearly that it's a Sabbath. So Hebrews 4 also points back to the origin of the Sabbath as having been in Genesis 2. But the early Hebrews also saw the Sabbath as the basis for understanding the rest of faith. In fact, the Sabbath reminds us what the rest is. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own works, just as God did from his. Now, if the Sabbath is seen as a burden, as some people would like to say, and that we have to be liberated from it, why then would Hebrews take this additional meaning to say that it's the symbol of our rest in Christ? If it's a bad thing, why would you use it as a symbol? Obviously, it's a good thing. And therefore, as we continue to observe the Sabbath, then we are always reminded of that relationship. A few years ago, I took my mom for a treatment to a place where a lot of people were seated around, and we had a lot of time waiting while my mom was under treatment. And I was able to talk to a Jewish fellow. Turns out, as we were talking there, this is in Florida, so it's not remarkable that I would find somebody that was Jewish. But we were talking about the Sabbath, and he made this very odd comment. He said, well, one day I hope to be able to keep it. And I thought, well, you're Jewish. You don't keep it. He said, well, I haven't made enough money. I'll make enough money. Then I can rest on the Sabbath. And I said, well, I've been to places where people don't have very much money and they're able to keep the Sabbath. And he said, well, you're right. You see, what was missing is that he didn't have the faith to keep God's day, to set aside other things. The Sabbath is not something to recommend you to God. The Sabbath is entering into his rest, putting aside other things so that you can devote it to remembering your Creator. And as we remember our Creator, then we know who we are. We are his creatures. We are his children. So it's an act of faith to keep the Sabbath. Some people know that far more. This past week in our prayer meeting, I have 2 prayer meetings, one in English and one in Spanish, and we do it online. One of the visitors who was in our group asked for prayer so that he could be able to keep the Sabbath as he had discovered it in Bible study. It's an act of faith to keep the Sabbath. It is resting in God's rest. Bible is never called the Jews' Sabbath. Never. It is given to them, but God always calls it my holy day, the Sabbath of the Lord. It's not something that's only restricted to the Jews. In fact, the commandment itself said that the stranger within the gates would be able to keep the Sabbath. In fact, they had to keep the Sabbath. They had to not require of them. Modern Jews don't understand that. And so they employ the goy, or the goyim, the non-Jews, to do work for them so that they can rest. But that wasn't what God intended. He intended it universally. Isaiah 56 also talks about the son of the stranger who enters into covenant with God, keeping God's Sabbath rest. So this is not just something for the Jews. This is an act of faith for anyone. Some of you know that Charlie Kirk had made a decision to keep the Sabbath, to set aside that time, special time for God. And he kept it probably better than a lot of Sabbath keepers. But he said it gave him a liberation because he had that space of time that he wasn't bombarded with all of the concerns and activities and interactions that he had the rest of the time. It's a blessing that God intended. He blessed the Sabbath day, and we enter into his rest. Certainly, there's considerable New Testament evidence showing that the Sabbath was described and observed by Jesus' disciples, by Jesus himself. We find it in Luke, and over again, people say, well, where do you find the Sabbath in the New Testament? Well, over and over again, throughout Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four Gospels, there are instances where Jesus is keeping the Sabbath in a different way than the Pharisees. He is liberating it. In fact, they said he was luoing the Sabbath. Luo is translated either destroy or loosing. And in their mind, not to keep the Sabbath like they kept it was to loose it. Hey, be separate. Thanks for joining us. So Jesus showed the Sabbath in a whole different light. He made it honorable. And if we go to the book of Acts, we see that Paul, over and over again, we've got chapter 13, several verses, chapter 15, it's mentioned again, chapter 16, chapter 17, chapter 18, over and over again, that Paul is observing the Sabbath, sometimes with Jews and Gentiles, sometimes with just Gentiles. Two of the instances are just Gentiles. So, safe to say, God's rest of faith in Hebrews is rooted in Sabbath observance, not in Sabbath abandonment or Sabbath substitution. There is no substitution. There is no mention of an eighth day in Hebrews, as we find in those early church fathers. Rather, there is an affirmation of the seventh-day Sabbath while discussing the rest that Israel never entered, which was not the rest of the Sabbath, which they obviously did engage in. It was that they never made it into Canaan. They died in the wilderness. This is a point of contrast. In chapter 3, it keeps talking about today, there's a new day to hear his voice and to respond. It contrasts not with the Sabbath. Sabbath is not even mentioned in chapter 3. It is the day of temptation, the day that Israel, that is the time that Israel did not listen to God and did not enter, as Hebrews says, by faith. If they had trusted him, they wouldn't have died in the wilderness. But David is quoted from the Psalms as saying, there remains a day. There is another day. And what is that other day? Well, we all have this opportunity to enter in. We can enter in. The Sabbath is brought in to reinforce that today, not to contrast with that today. The Sabbath helps us to understand how we enter in by faith. Now, let's go take a look at the lexical meaning of Sabbatismus. For many years, even as a pastor, I was unaware of this, because if you look at the lexical definition for the word Sabbatismus, which is the word that's used in chapter 4, verse 9, you will see that they have guessed at what it means based on how they interpret the passage. And they will tell you it's a hapax legomenon, which means it's a word that only occurs one time in the New Testament. And therefore, some people have said, well, the writer of Hebrews, be it Paul or somebody else, just made this word up. It's not true. There is actually usage of the term Sabbatismus elsewhere. So let's take a look here. The noun Sabbatismus occurs only once here in the Greek New Testament. It's not even in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. It's derived either from the noun or from the verb sabbatizo. I would say it's probably from the verb, because we see in the Syriac version that the word is not a noun, but rather a verb. It is to keep the Sabbath. It's a verb. So I think it's from the verb. Catholic Church eventually came to prohibit sabbatizing using the same Greek verb, which meant they outlawed resting on the Sabbath. So here's where you get this idea that it's a Sabbath kind of rest. It comes from Bauer, Arndt, and Gingrich. Sabbath observance, or the metaphorical Sabbath kind of rest. That's what they wanted it to mean. But then I ran across in the Anchor Bible, Gerhard Hasel's paragraph that lists something very different. Hebrews 4 states, there remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The word Sabbath rest translates the Greek noun sabbatismus, a unique word in the New Testament. This term also appears in Plutarch for Sabbath observance, in 4 post-canonical Christian writings which are not dependent on Hebrews 4, even in Justin Martyr, Epiphanius, Martyrdom of Peter and Paul, and the Constitution Apostolica, for this seventh-day Sabbath celebration. In each of these instances, it's talking about keeping the Sabbath. Just a messenger. Thanks for joining us. We're getting here. Going along. Here we go. So the metaphorical sense, such as the secondary lexical definition, is a theological interpretation rather than an actual definition. And that's what Mike Colburn's going to point to. He's going to say, well, within the passage, it means such and such. Actually, we need to go start with the actual meaning. And we find here that it means Sabbath keeping. So let's just run through some of those instances. Here you can see, oh, that our Greeks should found such barbarous rites, rolling themselves in dunghills, keeping of Sabbaths. Okay, Plutarch, this is around 100 AD, same time as Justin Martyr is writing. Here's Justin, or actually a little bit before Justin. Justin is talking about, for if there was no need of circumcision before Abraham, or observance of the Sabbath, sabbatismu, that's a form of sabbatismus. Or Epiphanius, this is in 375, around there. I have explained in connection with the Sabbath keeping, circumcision, and the rest. Okay, so again, it's Sabbath keeping. Martyrdom of Peter, keeping of Sabbaths. And then apostolic constitutions, thou shalt observe the Sabbath on account of him who ceased from his work of creation. So again, in each of these instances, we see that sabbatismus means Sabbath observance every single time. All right, now let's take a look at this within the context. It should be noted that the more frequently used rest was katapausis, which means calming or a resting place, as the resting place was to go into Canaan. God had promised them that, but they did not go in. They did not receive that physical rest of entering the promised land because they did not believe. So this mention of another day for rest should not be construed as meaning that the perpetual spiritual rest of today takes the place of the Sabbath. It's not talking about the Sabbath. The contrast of days is not between the Sabbath and today, but the day of temptation in the wilderness. All right? The day of provocation also, it's used, the provocation. So that's the contrast. Faithless Israel wandering through the wilderness, and those who will enter into God's rest because they trust him. For by grace are ye saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. We are saved by faith. As Romans says, it's from faith to faith. We're not saved by doing the right things. We do the right things because we have faith, because we trust in him. So today, God graciously provides another opportunity for his children to respond to his voice and enter. As he said in Matthew, you can receive his rest. And there, it's another pausis, it's an anapausis. It's a very similar word. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. Interestingly enough, this rest of soul is not something new, because it was promised also in Jeremiah 6:16. Stand ye in the way, see ye all the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. How was that? By following him, by doing as he said. So let's take a look at this Syriac. And I don't know how many of our viewers, can make anything out of the Hebrew characters, but Syriac is a script form of Hebrew. So we've converted the script into standard Hebrew characters. And when you do that, then I also transliterate, that is, to take it letter for letter so that we can read it in our English format. And so we have the original Syriac. You would read it from right to left, starts here to there. Okay, clarifies Sabbatismus further. We find here, this is, you see it's unpointed, so you're not going to find vowels in it, except where one letter might stand in for it. But here we have Meden, Soden, Kuyam, Hu, it remains, Lam Shabbatu, to keep the Sabbath. It remains to keep the Sabbath to the people of God. So the same thing can be drawn from the Greek of Hebrews 4. Ara apoletai sabbatismos to leo to theou. So then remains Sabbath observance to the people of God. So we can see that both the Syriac and the Greek are the same. If you don't read into it a metaphorical sense, you can understand it the same way. They're both saying the same thing. And the early Aramaic church understood it this way. This was their reading of that passage. And we can go to several different scholars who show this. The Bauscher version, for example, even if it tells us what the early believers understood the verse to mean. The Syriac word lam shabbatu in this verse is not a noun, but a verb, and it begins with lam, which is the infinitive to before the verb. The rest of the verb means keep the Sabbath. So to keep the Sabbath. If you want to look at other versions of the Syriac, Murdoch says, therefore it is established that the people of God are to have a Sabbath. Or Lamsa, it is the duty of the people of God to keep the Sabbath. And it's remarkable because Lamsa was not a Sabbath keeper, but yet he understood the Aramaic to read that way. So those two versions, they confirm one another. Now there's another translation, but it's really more of an interpretation, Victor Alexander. And he says he would not have that day. Therefore, he rose to be the Sabbath for the nation of God. That's that he rose is not in there at all. He is just really interpolated. He's shoved into it that which is not there. So it's not a proper translation and can be ignored. So I've summarized it here. I give you all the evidence. I put it in the context of the passage so that you can read this through. I will give you a link to this. It's on the academia.edu website, and I will have the latest version of this. Now, what happens if we spiritualize Sabbatismus? If a person claims that Hebrews 4:9 refers to a daily Sabbath-like rest, that's what that passage is literally saying, then it logically follows that person must also affirm from verse 10, because I have entered God's rest, I have ceased from my own works. I want that to sink in. Is that saying here that you're trusting in Jesus for your salvation? It's not what the verse says. It says, God ceased from his works, I ceased from mine. What Christian can say he never does his own works? If this is describing the Christian life, it doesn't make any sense. Now, some people have also read into the first part, because I've entered into God's rest, he who has entered into his rest has ceased from his own works as God did from his. How did God cease from his works? Was God working towards his own salvation and gave that up so he could be saved? No, he ceased from his labors. So you can't make a parallel there, because if you say that that I'm ceasing from my own efforts to save myself, which is a valid thing, because if you go to Hebrews 2, Ephesians 2, 8 and 9, and then verse 10, it says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." But then it goes on to say, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works." So it is the result of our faith that we should work good works. It's not the means of our salvation. And so I understand the idea that people want to say, well, I've ceased from my trying to save myself. Great. That's good, because you'll never do it. But that's not what this verse is saying. It says, as he ceased from his works, I cease from my works. When do we do that? On the Sabbath. We cease from the labors of the week so that we can enter into his rest. That's how the verse makes the most sense. Can we draw something from the Sabbath for the rest of our lives? Surely. As we are able to put ourselves in a frame of mind of trust in God as we enter his rest on the Sabbath, that helps us to do the same thing the rest of the time. But our weekly cycle, our what is it? It's a 7-day cycle. Circa septem, that's what it is. Circa septem. We have 7-day cycles. Our body operates on 7-day cycles. There's some independent research that's done that. God intends that we work on a 7-day cycle so that we're always moving towards that rest in him every week. If you cut loose from that, if you work all the time, you're going to wear yourself out. You need physical rest. You need spiritual rest. You need mental rest. And so God has provided it. The Sabbath was made for man. Okay, so trying to translate it some other way or read something into it doesn't make any sense. I like the Living Translation of Colossians 2:6. "And now, just as you trusted Christ to save you, trust him too for each day's problems. Live in vital union with him." Yeah, we are to have that rest. That's why Jesus says, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The Sabbath is physically needed for each of us. It's a blessing. Charlie Kirk recommended it to those, even those that choose to worship on Sunday, to have the Sabbath as God set it apart. Okay, so the problem with doing away the Sabbath is that it leaves no pattern of rest to follow. If the Sabbath disappears, what kind of Sabbath do you have? Sabbath observance is an example of katapausis rest. Ceasing from one's own works to enter God's holy day of rest requires trusting them. It's only those who keep the Sabbath by faith who understand what the rest offered today is. If one does not understand the Sabbath or the faith that is required to rest on it, then what would Sabbath-like rest be? What would it be? For those who think the Sabbath is a work to perform to gain God's pleasure, then Jesus is my working to gain God's favor. No, it's about trust. It's about trust. And keeping the Sabbath is about trust. That surely is not the sense of the passage. It describes those who do not enter God's katapausis rest because they did not receive the gospel by faith. True Sabbath observance is about trusting God enough that you can put aside your usual work, spend the day in prayer, study, fellowship, drawing closer to the Creator and Redeemer who rested on the Sabbath in creating the world. And after he uttered those powerful words, "It is finished," he also rested. Somebody asked me just this week, well, what about the thief on the cross? Did the thief on the cross keep a Sabbath? Well, he may have been a Jew and he may have kept a Sabbath, but he was also a thief and he was dying for his crimes, and he recognized that, as opposed to the other thief who was ridiculing Jesus on the cross. So that man reached out by faith in Jesus that day and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." He recognized that Jesus was a king, even though he didn't look like one. He was nailed to a cross. He was suffering. He was bleeding. He was barely holding on. He was dying on the cross. That whole time, he's dying. The restriction of everything that he uttered was just the shortest bursts of words. He didn't give any long discourses because it was everything he could do just to stay alive for a little bit longer. And he was in that horrible condition when that man turned to him and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And what was he saying? I trust in you. Now, Jesus died, we know, because it said, he said, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit. It is finished." And then it says he breathed out. He breathed out his last. And they were surprised that when they came to him, that he was already died. He had already died. And the other thieves were not so lucky. They were struggling on, and so they broke their legs so that they could not breathe, and they asphyxiated and they died. And so this fellow said, did the thief on the cross keep a Sabbath? Well, the first thought that occurred to me was, well, did the thief on the cross get baptized? Oh, therefore we don't need to be baptized. No, it says, "Whosoever believeth and is baptized shall be saved." Baptism is a necessary thing. Obviously, the thief couldn't be baptized, but he trusted, and it's by faith that he entered in. Remember, works follow our faith. Also, did the thief on the cross celebrate communion? Well, Jesus said, "This do in remembrance of me," and we should follow through with communion and remember him. But the thief didn't get that chance. He died. And then the next day, both he and Jesus no longer suffered, no longer labored to breathe. They rested. They rested the whole day. He entered into rest with his Savior. Isn't that amazing? So the thief on the cross did keep the Sabbath with Jesus. And the women who kept the Sabbath rested on that same day. So Sabbath keeping is a continual illustration of the rest of faith that believers have in Christ. It signifies trusting in the one who made you and who redeemed you. Okay. That's the whole of what I wanted to say. Those are the key ideas that I have there. I haven't been checking out the comments. I don't know if anybody has any questions here. It says that he called, Mike Colburn called me out. Well, I called him out too. And I have taken you to the Bible, to the context, to the literal meanings, the application. You can see it all. You can see the evidence. What say you? Well, glad you spent some time with me. If there's no further questions, we'll just post this for somebody else to see later. Everyone take care. God bless.